This is a Chronicle podcast.
This is the history of the greatest of all man-made events. These men are part of that history. They are eyewitnesses to the triumphs and tragedies of the war wherever it was fought. Their testimony is part of the story of how our world was made. By those who could pay and those who could no longer meet. The price of empire.
Welcome to Chronicle's History Making Podcast, where we go behind the scenes of what it takes to make history documentaries. My name is Dan Jobson, director and filmmaker, and I'm here today with Michael Cove, creator, writer, and narrator of Price of Empire. Now, in the last episode, we ended just as Japan had plunged China into war, Mussolini had introduced fascism to Italy, and the German National Socialists and their Führer had dismantled democracy. Today, I want to talk about episode 2, the period of that strange lull that was coined by an American senator as the phony war. Now, every country pretty much has their own name for this period, don't they?
They all pretty much say the same thing. I think the Germans called it the Sitzkrieg, and the French called it the drôle de guerre, the funny war. But yeah, everybody was... I forget who it was. It'll come to me. But someone, some politician said, I've seen plenty of wars that have been fought without being declared, but this is the first war that I've seen being declared without being fought. Yeah, war had been declared and no one was doing any fighting.
Given that this episode is further along in the timeline, as we said, episode 1 was all about the build-up to this invasion of Poland, we see far more eyewitnesses and actual interviewees in this episode. I just want to touch a little bit on that. What was it like at the time? Did you realise the gravity that it would have now, 7-8 years later, of being able to interview these eyewitnesses at the time? What did it feel like?
No, I don't suppose that I was conscious of the fact that I should have been, because it was pretty obvious, but I don't think I was conscious of the fact that I was probably taking the last or one of the last opportunities to hear such eyewitness stories. The people that I interviewed ranged from their late 80s to their mid-90s, and I can't give you an exact number, but many of them would be no longer with us as we speak. And so I was blessed to be able to capture something of their stories, and I don't think I was conscious at the time of the reaction that I would get or that I would cause in some of the respondents. So that was quite a sort of learning experience as well.
So on that, what would you say, what is the main thing you learnt while interviewing these? Not so much in content, but how did you go about broaching such sensitive topics? And were there any takeaways you learnt, especially in the early interviews, that affected the latest?
Well, I think that it was actually relatively straightforward, because I was interviewing people who were, as it were, on the ground. I wasn't interviewing people who were in the corridors of power or in the command centres militarily. There were no people who were in that sort of category. Interestingly, some of them ended up in that category, but of course, at the time of the Second World War, these were all young men, and so they were either beginning of their military careers, or they were enlisted for the war, and that was the end of their military careers. I knew that what I wanted from my interviewees was the personal experience of war. So I pretty much went into every interview, and I conducted about 50, Many of them I conducted, and some of them I conducted by proxy because I don't speak Russian and I don't speak Japanese. But I went into each of them with one question. Can you tell me about your war?
Making it personal straight away, your war.
And in some cases, that's all that was needed. In some cases, I suppose in most cases, I had the role of picking up on things that were said that were not perhaps clear to an audience that might not have the context. So maybe a description of an action, and you needed the person to actually explain where they were or why that happened or what it might be. So there was a sort of going back over the narrative that they had supplied and seeking clarification and
potentially different sideline stories that you...
Yeah. But I made the decision, without really thinking about it, that the people to find for Price of Empire were the eyewitnesses. And as soon as I made that decision, it was pretty clear that what you would be asking them was, what did you see? I mean, what do you ask an eyewitness? What did you see?
Would you say now, in retrospect, looking back on it, is there anything you would have done differently with these interviews?
I'm not really meaning to sound as though I'm tootling my trumpet, but actually no. Having said that, the answer's the same for every project. Yes, I wish I'd had more time. Yes, I wish I'd had more time to spend with the individual interviewees, which in some cases I had ample time, and in some cases simply because of how the local roster had been organised, there wasn't as much time as you might have wanted. And when an interview ends with the person still talking and you looking at your watch and saying, look, I'm really sorry, but the next person's here, then there's a cause for regret. So, that's absolutely the consistent complaint of any program maker. I wish I had more time. I wish I had more time in setting it up. I might have found more people, but I was really fortunate with the cross-section that I did find, and they managed to populate the story pretty comprehensively.
And you can really see that as the story is being told. Now, you interview Moshe Fitzman. I'm not sure if I'm 100%... Moshe, a Polish Holocaust survivor.
Yep.
And he talks about, during the invasion of Poland, that straight away as the Germans arrived, there was that absolute feeling of terror. Can you tell me a little bit about interviewing Moshe?
Absolutely. I'll start by So Moshe died only a couple of years ago. I was put in touch with him through the Holocaust Centre in Melbourne. He wrote a thin memoir called, I hope I don't get this wrong, My Promise Never to Forget. And anybody who's interested in finding out more of Moshe's story can get that book, I think, through the Holocaust Centre in Melbourne. So I interviewed 3 Holocaust survivors, thanks to the cooperation of the Holocaust Centre down there. And Moshe was, he's a real character. He's very forthright, very unforgiving. It wouldn't be any good expecting him to say that, he won't forget, but he has forgiven. He'd neither forgotten nor forgiven. He brought his Star of David armband to the interview for me to see. He'd kept that. So from when he was in the ghetto before being moved to the concentration camps, he'd had to wear the armband, as they all did, and he'd kept it. The thing that stands out for me as a memory of my interview with Moshe, apart from the fact that my father's name was Moshe.
Wow,
so when you look at the spelling of it, as you did, you're not unsure about the pronunciation. And I asked him, I said, is it Moshe? And he said, yes, it's been good enough for me. And I said, yeah, no, fine. I was just... Anyway, but the interesting thing about Moshe in terms of what I think he still, and it is interesting, isn't it, all these years later, he still couldn't understand, really, how it had happened, in the sense that what he said in the interview was, the people we are talking about, they did this, and these are the people who, and then he quoted if you know it, the opening lines of the Schiller poem, which comprise the Ode to Joy in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony.
Okay.
So what he was saying was, here's this cultured people who can lay claim to ownership of things like Beethoven, Mozart, Schiller, Goethe, whatever. And those are the people who did this. And I think he struggled. The reason, I think more than anything else, that particular example of genocidal behavior is that it is so unexpected in a nation that prided itself on being the most cultured and civilized, if you like. And they did the least cultured and the least civilized thing that it's possible to imagine. So,
And can I just ask, was Moishe, he was a civilian?
they were all civilians. They were all young. So Moishe was, there's a couple of photos in his book. I mean, he's just a young, I don't know what age he would have been, late teens or early 20s, I suppose, when Poland was invaded.
Another Polish interviewee that features in episode 2 is Zbigniew Stelmach.
Yeah.
He was actually part of the Polish army, and he recalls in this moment where Polish troops were gathered and told that they were being shipped to America, where in fact they were being taken to the forests. How was it interviewing Zbigniew, and what was his first-hand account of actually being in the Polish army?
So the way that interview came about is interesting for a couple of reasons. And one of the reasons is that it is illustrative of the advantage of living in Australia. Because as with Moishe, you're talking about people who came here after the war, displaced persons, Holocaust survivors, whatever. I put an appeal out on local radio, local ABC radio here in Canberra. And one of the replies that I got was from a fellow who was driving along in his car, and he heard it. And he'd met Dr. Stelmach in Italy. And it was a really interesting story because he'd been to see the rebuilt Monte Cassino,
Okay.
the site of a great battle, and he was having coffee, and there was this other family from Australia, including Dr. Stelmach, and he got into this conversation, and he said to Dr. Stelmach, "I've been to see Monte Cassino. Have you seen it?" And Dr. Stelmach said, "Yes, I was there." He said, "Yes." He said, No, I was there.
I was there.
So that's
I saw the first version.
That's how I got on to him, and he was in Melbourne, and his daughter, who's also a doctor, sort of facilitated it. He was in an aged care home by then, and what was one of the things that I think was clear, but I knew this anyway from my own parents, and I mean particularly from my mother, who was an air raid warden in the Blitz. Nothing can ever challenge the memories of living through such huge times, and hugely theatrical times. So whatever happens to you in the rest of your life, which could be decades and decades, nothing seems to even slightly erase the memories of that vivid...
Or compare.
Yeah. No, so that thing that you mentioned, the, in quotes, deportation of the officer and intellectual class by the Soviets. So when the Soviets on the 17th invade Poland from the east, the Germans having invaded from the west a couple of weeks earlier, by agreement they invade under the secret protocols of the pact. And something around 6,700 or something Polish officers are murdered in Katyn Forest. And this is discovered by Goebbels, who tries to make plenty of publicity, but of course the Soviets deny it until 1989-90. But Dr. Stelmach, of course, in the interview, you talk about, no matter how much time passes, you still can't understand. And he I think it was an uncle of his who was one of the victims in the Katyn forest, and he says, they said that they sent him here or they sent him there, and of course he was shot in the forest. And I think he says, so they lied, didn't they? So it's still, you can't ever quite get past the question marks. Why
That's
did
right.
it happen? Why did they do it to us? Particularly with that side of the war on civilians, and we're talking about the Soviets as being culpable here, not the Nazis, but there's this sort of unparalleled violence that is a component of the Second World War, and people still look at it and find that the question marks are, they can't be moved, they're immovable.
After the invasion of Poland, Russia then turned to Finland, where incidentally it also notes the Molotov cocktail was invented in the battle. As a result of invading in Helsinki, they were thrown out of the League of Nations. The League of Nations gets overlooked quite a bit nowadays. What is some of that good work that they actually did?
It is a shame, because it's sort of, with the passing of each year, the League of Nations seems to become even more of a whipping boy or even a laughing stock in terms of what was only one of its many functions or its many aspirations. And the same's true of the United Nations. I mean, the Security Council might meet and then fail to do something, but meanwhile, there's all sorts of things going on around the world.
Well, we've got the parallel right now with Antonio Guterres is in the Ukraine and has just met with Vladimir Putin.
And if he has no effect whatsoever, it doesn't detract from the work that the United Nations does in the same areas, essentially, as the League of Nations. And the League of Nations did do good work in human trafficking, in child labour and other labour laws, in
and this was all in the period between
between the wars, in displaced persons, and we would now call them, refugees or whatever you want to call them, but they had this program for the displaced persons who had been moved around in the map making that followed the First World War. And it also had some successes in conciliation between minor powers. It was an occasion in Europe, it was an occasion in South America where League of Nations conciliation was effective. But I think it was one of the British statesmen, I can't remember which one, who said the League of Nations was, and I'm paraphrasing because the quote won't come to my mind, but he said to the effect, the League of Nations is effective when sparrows are fighting, but when eagles are fighting.
So just going back to some of these stories that you actually got out of the interviewees, particularly Moisha and Dr. Stelnach, once you've captured that interview, and you've obviously already written your narrative, how did you find the process of selecting your grabs, as it is, out of that interview?
It's always an interesting, sometimes challenging, sometimes frustrating process. And I'll say something now which people listening to this are absolutely given permission by me to regard as being ridiculous. But the ridiculous thing that I actually think helps me is that I'm so old that when I went to school, they were still teaching English grammar, and English literature was a separate subject. When you did exams, you did 2 exams in English, one in language or grammar and one in literature. Okay. And one of the fundamental things that you had to do in studying English language was précis.
Précis?
Yeah. So that means you would be given a piece of work and you would be told, get this down to 200 words without losing the sense of it.
Okay.
And we'd grind through précis writing week in, week out, along with other long-forgotten and probably properly forgotten things like clause analysis and all of that sort of thing.
Well, it actually sounds quite good
Well,
interrogative thinking.
I actually think, okay, it's taken many decades for me to get to a point where I can look back and go, actually, that was worth doing. But when it comes to looking at the structure of your script and looking at the structure of the transcript of an interview and working out how these things can be married up, and that includes, as people would know or would expect, actually looking at the transcript of the interview and not being committed to a paragraph, and if the paragraph doesn't work, you're in trouble. But without changing the sense of what people are saying, people, and I'm probably the worst example of it, people sort of talk in disjointed ways. They introduce clauses into the middle of sentences that don't belong there, and they finish a sentence that they started 3.5 minutes ago. And
That's the beauty of the spoken word, though, isn't it?
That's right, and you don't want to check that. And in interviewing people, I never say to them, oh, could you say that in a more compact... I think that'll be my job when I get the transcript.
To edit it down.
So between all of those sorts of complications that exist, so long as you look at them in that sort of structural way and with a reasonable integrity, that you don't want to literally put sentiments into people's mouths. If it's not what they said, then they didn't say it and you live without it. But that's sort of the process for me. I do, as you said, I mean, I do write the whole thing before I go off, or wherever the opportunity exists. I know sometimes hasn't been, but generally I write the whole thing.
Do you find it easier if you've pre-written everything before staging the interviews, or does sometimes...
Absolutely. I think if I don't write the script before I conduct the interviews, then I feel insufficiently informed to conduct the interviews, and I also feel insufficiently informed about the ideal shape of the program. And you know, when someone's talking and you're listening to them and you're going, yep, that's going straight in, and well, that's not quite where the story goes. And you can, you're not trying to put words into people's mouths, but you're trying to make sure that their contribution is going to sit with the direction of the narrative. And if you haven't written it up beforehand, then I just, especially if I'm conducting the interviews, I would feel particularly ill-prepared, both
Absolutely.
From the point of view of content and from the point of view of program shape.
And also, I guess, in actually honouring what they say and giving it the due power of, especially in this case where it's an eyewitness account and you actually truly want to take in that personal notion.
Absolutely. And then if the eyewitness account, which is always a possibility and certainly was the case in several of my respondents, takes you beyond what you had said, as how could it not? Because you didn't know what these people's individual experiences were in battle or wherever. And when you learn what they were, you want that in the program. Well, you're just going to have to rewrite what you wrote in order to accommodate what they have shared with you.
I've just got one final question for you today, Michael, that just made me think of. When you are selecting these takes, you're rewriting, obviously you've done all of the pre-planning before you've written, you've done the research, you've written your story. As a history writer, what do you find is the difference between your role and a historian? Given that they're both arts of storytelling, how do you find it differentiates you in terms of responsibility?
I think, well, there's a couple of directions that I could take in answering that, I think. And they're complementary, they're not exclusive.
A slippery slope.
Well, one is, and I think I mentioned this to you before, I mean, one is an awareness of the medium. So I'm not writing for print. I'm not writing something which someone's going to read in their own time, skip if it's some page that they're familiar with or reread if they didn't get it, or the reality of the medium in which I'm working and the craft that is involved in, hopefully, writing for that medium. And that's different from the concerns of the historian, whether it's, someone who is writing for a large market, the popular historians like the Anthony Beevors and the Max Hastings and Richard Overys and people, Ian Kershaw, people like that. So they're obviously concerned to write fluently. They're obviously concerned to write in a way which engages the reader. And I guess they're also concerned that their choice of subject is something which will be supported in the marketplace. But they're not concerned with have we got the pictures with which to illustrate this? They're not concerned with how am I going to integrate interviews into this, and they're not concerned with how am I going to deliver this in 50-minute slices. So that's one aspect, I think, of how I don't feel like a historian when I'm doing it. I think the other aspect, though, probably is to do with why you're doing it. I think historians necessarily have as a key motivation the idea of adding to the knowledge of something. So they may therefore look for primary sources. They spend time in archives. They spend time in archives around the world, and they come up with something which is a fresh look at
new insight,
Operation Barbarossa or whatever you like, because, hey, if you're going to write a book about it, I've got bad news for you. There are lots of books about it, so why are you doing it? And the historian, I think, needs... it doesn't need, I think automatically has that sense of having something original to bring to the debate. With the business of creating the program, you develop your own sort of perspective, your own sense, and then you put on a title which maybe indicates what you've sort of felt. But it's not why you start. Why you start is because someone says to you, or you've said to someone and they said, yes, go for it. What about this for an idea?
In the same
They never
way.
turn around and say to you, do you have anything original to say about it? That's not a question that gets asked. I mean, so yeah, it probably should be asked. And if the answer is no, you probably shouldn't do it, because there are lots of documentaries out there as well. But it's not the key sort of impetus. Whereas I think with the historian saying, right, my next book's going to be about.
That's right. I think
so it is entertainment. We are firstly in the entertainment space, and then there are sort of subunits under entertainment.
Personal enrichment that entertainment provides.
So if you look at sort of a structure of the business, it's like entertainment, and then you follow the line down to factual programs, and then you follow the line from there to history documentaries. You follow the line from there to Second World War, and you arrive at Price of Empire.
Well, on that point of arriving at Price of Empire, we'll wrap things up here. Thank you very much for your time today, Michael.
My pleasure.
And next week, we'll move on to the actual invasion of the Low Country and the beginning of the war in Europe.
Thank you.
This is Dan Jobson, and I've been talking with Michael Cove, the creator, writer, and narrator of The Price of Empire.
You've been listening to a Chronicle podcast.